This week's topic is, well, we have two topics this week. So our first topic for this week is going to be on economics and exchange, or anthropological approaches to economic organization. And then our follow-up topic is going to be on political organization, and I'm going to introduce briefly to you the topic of inequality and inequity, which we'll get back into a little bit later on in this term. Now, I like to begin with what I call my unfair summary of how economics work. And it's because outside of the anthropology classroom, the focus on economics tends to be on a capitalist economy. And one of the first things we see when we apply a cross-cultural perspective is that capitalism is only one form of economic structures. And this is why I say it's unfair, because, again, not all economists focused on capitalism, right? But there are some key things that I want you to kind of shift away from or shift your thinking from as we start to approach our understanding of economic systems. So first and foremost is that the individual is not always the unit of the economy. So we're going to look at the role individuals do or do not play in economic systems. And then we'll also talk a little bit about value, and there's a number of different ways we can get into this throughout the term, and we'll look at some examples in class as well. So interestingly, what anthropologists have actually spent a lot of time examining is not so much capitalist economies, but instead non-market-based, non-individual as the unit of economy, non-capitalist systems of exchange. And this is because, again, as I mentioned, our cross-cultural perspective tells us that not only is capitalism not the most common form of economic exchange or economic organization, but also we have to remember that capitalism is relatively new. If we look at the archaeological record, for example, what we see is that for a significant part of human history, we were what are called foragers, right? So the economy was structured under different principles. And what we're going to talk about how subsistence practices such as foraging, or the ways in which we get what we need to survive, often are part and parcel of or I shouldn't say part and parcel, but they're essentially the structuring component of the economic system as a whole, that it plays a big role in determining what kind of economies people have. The other thing is that, of course, the economy is not an isolated sector or a structure or institution within a society, right? So we're calling holism in terms of the anthropological perspective. We have to remember that the economy intersects with and interrelates to various other structures and institutions within a society. Further, it's also a social and cultural construct, which means that it too is subject to the same sort of processes that change and influence cultures as well. So, economic anthropology then is a subfield within anthropology by which anthropologists are attempting to understand, as this definition shows, those issues relating to human nature that are directly or specifically related to, again, how do we get and obtain or procure the things we need in order to survive, right? So this is how Wilk and others have defined as the part of our discipline that debates issues of human nature that relate directly to the decisions of daily life and making a living. And what this means is that, yes, we can still focus on the individual as our unit if we want, but we don't have to as well. We might look at other groupings of individuals. There's a number of different approaches economic anthropologists have taken. We see these in our textbook, and I have some examples throughout here as well. And again, it varies based on what our research questions are. So what is it about the economy or about economic organization for that particular group we are attempting to understand, right? So are we looking at, again, these larger institutions and how they're shaping human behaviors, or are we looking at how individuals are attempting to deal with things like scarcity? And this is something we can think about in terms of, again, having very practical applications to the real world. If we think about some of the issues we're facing in our own society right now relating things like scarcity, right? Supply chain issues and whatnot. So it's important to keep this in mind. Now, there's a bunch of background information that I've provided in here. It's a summary of a lot of the principles that are addressed in your textbook as well. But it's important to understand that there are some basic fundamentals of economics that also inform economic anthropology as well. Now, Anthropology has been heavily influenced, like many other social sciences, by things like Marxism. And we see this really pronounced when we talk about economic anthropology. Interesting, those of us who study technology, Marxism has influenced that as well, but that's a whole other side thing. But what this means is that some of the fundamentals then that we've focused on as anthropologists involve these. So production and labor. And so when we talk about production as anthropologists, we follow again a lot of these kind of fundamental concepts that that come from economics and studies of economics more broadly, right? So what is the mode of production? What are the means of production? And what are the relations of production? And as you can imagine, as anthropologists, the relations of production are of a lot of interest to us, right? How are people interacting with each other as relates to the transformation of raw material, right? Using skills and tools and our knowledge and our technologies, and how are we organizing labor in order to produce what we need, right? So that means that labor has also been something that we have studied quite extensively. And of course, we can look at how labor is defined. We can look at different kinds of labor, so voluntary versus force. Recently, in the last few decades, there's been a lot of emphasis on looking at labor and compensation. So for example, how different kinds of labor are valued within society in terms of how they are actually financially compensated. So what are you paid? What is the difference and distinctions we make between paid and unpaid labor? What are the spheres of society in which these kinds of labors occur? And again, I'd like to talk with you folks about this a little bit more in class, because one of the things that we have also seen with this shift in the context of the pandemic is rethinking what labor means. And we can talk a little bit, if you'd like, because those of you on social media might be really familiar with the anti-work movement that's currently going on. And there's a lot of discussion around this, right? And a lot of it has to come down to that a lot of the labor that's being performed is being defined, or has traditionally been defined as being performed by people who are unskilled. Well, what does unskilled labor mean? What does that tell us about the values we have when we say that particular forms of labor do not require skill? The reality is almost every form of labor requires some skill or another, but it's just how we value different kinds of skills that allow us for that assignment, and therefore compensation. Also, how are we compensated for our labor, and what does that look like? Working from home used to be a perk. Now it's just a reality for many folks, and a reality that many folks want to continue into the future, even as we hopefully transition into a post-pandemic environment or world. Something else that we can look at is the division of labor. So who performs the kind of labors that they do? And this is very interesting to anthropologists because of how it reflects a lot of other ways that we construct difference within our society. So we might divide labor on the basis of gender, on the basis of age, right? On the basis of, again, where this is being performed. But a lot of it comes down to, again, individual identities and how those are constructed. Probably the most significant area that anthropologists have studied economic systems relates to exchange. And so exchange is a very important concept in anthropology, right? So looking at the movement of what I call material culture, so all the things that humans make and use and produce and interact with, because it provides so much insight into who we are. And a lot of this comes from archaeology as well, because that's what we study as archaeologists, right? Is the remnants of the past that have been preserved in a way that we can study them. And so material culture provides a lot of information about various aspects. And one of the things we're interested in is the movement of material culture and how it might or might not reflect the movement of people, for example, right? We have to remember that's not just material culture that is exchange, but also information, and in some regards, even people. And so we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about marriage as a particular form of exchange that can occur. We also have to think about where exchange is occurring. It can be internal, so within a society, within a particular group, or it can be external between different cultural groups. And so globalization is an important topic that we need to talk under this umbrella as well. So familiarize yourself with these different modes of exchange. And we're going to talk a lot about reciprocity in particular in lecture this week, because again, I want to step away from the mode of exchange that we're very familiar with in our capitalist economy that we have here in the West, which is market exchange. But I also want to talk about reciprocity because it's actually a mode of exchange that we engage with all the time, but you may not think of it as such. And as such, it's been really vital for anthropologists to study. So here are some hallmarks or key traits of what reciprocity looks like. And again, on each of these slides, what I've tried to do for you folks is outline very clearly as much as possible. So who's involved in exchange, the mechanics or the mechanisms of how goods are being exchanged or information's being exchanged, and then also a little bit of information regarding things like evaluation of goods or information or whatever is being exchanged within the context of each of these different modes. And then in lecture, I'd like to go over some examples of not only reciprocity, but also the difference between generalized and balanced, between positive reciprocity and negative reciprocity. Okay, a classic example of balanced reciprocity, and again, we'll go over this in lecture in person because it's a very interesting system. It's kind of seen as a foundational study that's been done in anthropology relating to economic systems and related to reciprocal exchange in particular, and that is which of the kula. So we'll spend a bit more time talking about this. But what this shows is how again, from a holistic perspective, what we start to see is that exchange is rarely purely on the basis of what we might call kind of economic principles or values, right? And especially reciprocity is that sometimes the trade or exchange of necessary items, so what we might call consumer goods, becomes hidden beneath the exchange of other items that have other forms of value. And so the example we're going to look at with the kula is the movement of white shell armbands and red shell necklaces, and how these objects, these important, culturally important, significant items are exchanged in the context of the kula to solidify relationships between groups. So this is a form of exchange that occurs between various groups, and how part of this exchange has a lot to do with prestige and establishing, again, those kind of interpersonal connections between groups that might open to things like marriage and other kinds of partnerships and relationships. And how these partnerships are formed are not only are they inherited, but they also serve very practical purposes. Sometimes it's because simply on one of the islands a particular good is available that isn't available on others. But it also again has this importance of a social component of people forming and solidifying social bonds between communities that will then later facilitate other forms of exchange, such as marriage. So again, in class on Wednesday, we'll talk about this, and I'll go over this diagram in a little bit more detail for you folks. Redistribution is another form of exchange. Again, we're familiar with this as well. And so this is when a central authority, and this will make a bit more sense when we talk about politics as well in our next topic, and then are redistributed. And again, who the central authority is can vary based on how the society is organized from a political perspective. So in this diagram here is showing what happens within a chiefdom context, where you have a chief as the principal authority who collects the goods and then redistributes them out to various partners within this larger network. A key distinction between reciprocity and redistribution is basically the status of the individuals involved, right? So in this case with redistribution, we have inequity that exists because, again, the central authority has a lot more power and prestige and access to goods than external members within the redistribution network does. Reciprocity, on the other hand, tends to be exchange between individuals who are quote unquote equal. And we'll talk about what that means again a bit more in class. Again, market exchange, I won't talk about this too much because this is something very familiar with students. Something that I want to highlight about market exchange that makes it a little bit different is that money becomes the medium of exchange, or you may have cases where there's goods of equal worth. So what do we mean by this? Well, that we're no longer exchanging items on the basis of the relationships that we're attempting to establish between individuals, but rather on the value of those items that have been predetermined or assigned to those objects, right? So we have general purpose money, for example, here in Canada, right? So I can take my toonie and I can walk into my favorite store, Dollarama, and this is not a sponsored ad, by the way, but I can walk in there and presumably purchase almost anything in that store for my toonie, right? in theory. But we all know that Dollarama has some goods that are valued more than $1. But anyways, you get the idea, right? That it doesn't matter, right? So I can use that dollar or that toonie to buy Dr. Pepper or candy or chocolate, or actually something I really need right now, which is aluminum sheets for cooking, right? So I can use it to buy a whole bunch of different kinds of goods. Special purpose money, on the other hand, is money that can only be exchanged for particular items or goods, or again, goods of equal worth that can only be exchanged for each other. An example of special purpose money would be like Canadian Tire money. So for example, it might be general purpose in that you can use it to purchase anything in Canadian Tire, but with very few exceptions, Canadian Tire money doesn't have any value outside of this kind of localized market that Canadian Tire has constructed. Another example comes from my former in-laws. And so Grandpa on my in-law side of the family used to exchange pigeons for cats. And this is interesting because you might be saying, but Dr. Biittner, that sounds like reciprocity, where two individuals, so two farmers of equal status, are exchanging goods. But I like to argue that chickens kind of served, or sorry, not chickens, pigeons kind of served as special purpose money because there's a value that was assigned to them, right? So I believe the going rate of exchange was that for two pigeons, Grandpa could get a cat, right, or a kitten at a nearby farm. And we can think of some other examples, or you folks might be able to think of other examples of special purpose money in the context of the course. Another thing that sets apart market exchange from reciprocity in particular is competition, right? So bartering doesn't exist in the realm of reciprocity, right? So if I say, hey folks, I need some help moving this weekend. If people come help me move, in exchange, I will give you beer and pizza or pop of your choice. There's no bartering involved in that, right? It's simply me saying, hey, in exchange for the service, I will give you folks this for helping me out, right? However, in the marketplace, bartering and competition is very common. Now, a particular form of reciprocity that I want to look at more specifically in this course, and again, we can talk about this on Wednesday, is gift exchange. And gift exchange is an extremely powerful mechanism for moving goods and information very long distances. But why anthropologists have really narrowed in on gift exchange is because of the role it plays in, as I mentioned here, creating and solidifying social obligations. That what is important about gifts, in many cases, is not the gift itself, but rather the connections that it forms between individuals. Most of this comes from the early work of Marcel Mauss and his kind of foundational piece of work, The Gift, where he looked at the forms and functions of gift exchange as a total social phenomena. And so I'm going to show you a clip that a dear colleague and friend of mine created, showing you a summary of a good example of how these three obligations of gift exchange play out in the real world, using an episode of Big Bang Theory. Now, love or hate this show, this is actually one of the best representations and discussions of gift exchange I've ever seen. So tune in on Wednesday and I'll show you this clip, and then we can discuss these obligations a little bit more. And the other thing that comes out of understanding of the work of Marcel Mauss and looking at gift exchange as a particular form of reciprocity is that there are a lot of rules around gift exchange. So cross-culturally speaking, all societies practice gift exchange. Where they vary is this, right? So all societies have these obligations that exist relating to gift exchange. So all have the obligations to give gifts, receive gifts, and to repay gifts. And we'll talk about why repayment is the most imperative. But where they vary, where we see this cross-cultural variation, comes from the rules around when to give a gift, what to give a gift, how to give a gift, how to accept a gift, when we repay, and what we repay. And again, we can talk about this in lecture with a couple of examples you folks can bring to our discussion. And then I have some cross-cultural examples of various forms of exchange. A very popular one that's often talked about here in North America relates to potlatching, an indigenous practice by Pacific Northwest Coast peoples. And the reason why we spend time talking about this is because this was a practice that under colonization was outlawed and banned. And a lot of the reasons why it was outlawed or banned was because potlatching was misunderstood, misinterpreted, and dismissed by European settlers into the region, that they didn't understand the significance and the value of potlatching within these communities. And so some communities have started to revitalize the potlatch, again, as a mechanism of reclaiming culture and important cultural practices in this post-colonial context. The other thing I want you to think about that has come out of anthropological research and looking at cross-cultural variations in exchange is that, well, I've kind of given you these three broad modes of exchange. So there's actually a whole bunch of other ways that we exchange goods that fall under this. And again, we can talk about some of these. And if some of these you're not familiar with, I recommend you take a quick peek and do some Googling before you come back in. But for example, robbery or theft is a kind of exchange, is it not? But where does it then sit within these various modes? Like, is it a form of market exchange? Is it a form? It's not really reciprocity, is it? Maybe it's a form of redistribution, but it doesn't kind of fit there. And so Davis's work was meant to illustrate this. And so he was just looking at within Britain various forms of exchange types. So speaking with different people, and several of these, and this was the list he generated, that don't quite fit in necessarily within the modes that we have defined within anthropological research and within economic studies more broadly. So I want to talk a little bit more about this and think and see if you folks can come up with any other forms of exchange that we engage in that allow us to move goods and procure goods or move information or obtain information that aren't quite captured here. And there's a few that I can think of that are coming out of explicitly the pandemic context that aren't captured on this list. And this is now almost a 20-year-old list. So yeah, there's definitely more different types of exchange that are present and visible. The other thing I wanted you to take a look at from the textbook was looking at, again, how economic organization, then if we look at it holistically, is more than simply just the mode of exchange, right? That economic organization takes into consideration other aspects of society. And this example that looks at the work of anthropologist Nicole Gombe shows us how the economy for the Inuit community she worked with was not only a market system, but also had what she defined as a local economic system, what may be called an indigenous, a community, an informal, or a so-called vernacular economy. An economy that was linked more strongly with beliefs or worldview, which we'll talk about later on in the course, ways of working, so various forms of labor, but also things like social relations, value, how food is thought of and constructed. So it's not just simply that an object is defined as food, but the place that food has within the society as important or significant, again, from a cultural perspective, not only a nutritional perspective as well. The other example that I want to engage you folks in as that relates to economies, again, is a more emergent economy, and is how under the process of globalization and the rise of online economies, we've had to reshift and rethink about what economic organization looks like. And my favorite example of looking at online economies relates to one of my research areas, which is games, right, or gaming. And so while I don't study online games specifically, there's been a lot of work by anthropologists looking at online games and their virtual economies that they have, including things like in-game currencies. And what's really interesting about these is how we have these virtual in-game currencies and economic systems that have developed. Usually they're linked with the real world, right? So think about play-to-pay games and stuff like that. But they're also linked with, again, other aspects of gaming and play as well. So an example of this is so-called metagame currencies. So these are not necessarily official currencies that are used in games, but are rather forms of currency or reward systems that are built by players. And they're most famously associated with what are called MMORPGs, or massive multiply online play, or massively, wait, I have it on the other slide here. I always get this wrong. Yeah, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. There we go. And one of the original games was Ultima Online, but games like the Elder Scrolls games, sometimes when these became the MMORPG versions of this became like this. World of Warcraft, of course, is one of the biggest ones. There's tons of these that have this, and an example of this would be Dragon Kill Points. And so this is a scorekeeping system that is used by guilds. Basically, players can earn credit for the various tasks that they perform in-game as a member of the guild. So this is an old version of a DKP system that was created by a guild in World of Warcraft. And so this relates to the allocation of various goods that the guild members collect. So it is both a market system whereby players can obtain these DKPs and then use them to exchange them as a special form of currency, right? In-game currency, to obtain various items, objects, and whatnot that the guild has collected through the course of doing raids and other activities in the in-game world. So it's seen as a mechanism for ensuring that all players who contribute are able to get access to the goods that the group as a whole has collectively been able to procure. And so while this is in some regards a market system, it's also a redistribution system, right? So the guild leaders are in charge of these systems and monitoring these various transactions. But there's also some reciprocity that's involved here as well. So I don't want you to think that these modes of exchange that we have are have rigid boundaries, right? But rather are fairly fluid, especially once we get into practice. It's hard for me to talk about online economies without talking about the work of someone who I did my graduate studies with, the wonderful Alicia Hibbert, who did a master's degree in anthropology, looking at, and actually in digital humanities as well. I think it was across an interdisciplinary degree, looking at basically things like DKP systems and fun and fairness in World of Warcraft. And some of the conclusions that Alicia came up with is that, for example, first and foremost, that player perceptions of real money trading in the context of the game are perceived of differently in terms of player understandings of games as fun and also as fairness in the world. Real money trading, for example, became justified because individual progression was seen as promoting the fun of the collective. So if you had a guild member, for example, who had a lot of real world money and was able to procure or purchase in-game items that benefited the guild as a whole, it was seen as, oh, well, great. This is someone who is leveraging their privilege and their resources for the benefit of all. However, subsequent studies of things like gold farming have shown that attitudes around the use of real-world funds in game economies varies based on perceptions around things like fun and fairness. And so we can talk a little bit more about gold farming, and we can look at how this has kind of transformed into recent years into something that honestly I don't know a lot about, but seems to speak a lot to kind of some of the gold farming practices, which relates to things like Bitcoin mining, and we can talk about NFTs as well. But these are interesting because, again, anthropologists are having to understand these kind of emergent economies as well, and using the information we have from our cross-cultural understanding of how economic systems work in order to understand these new kind of decentralized global, again, online or virtual economies and economic systems. Part of some of the controversy around gold farming and other in-game currencies and whatnot relate also to labor. And Richard Heeks raises some important points that I'd like to talk about in class relating to cyber work and how cyber work represents what we might call liminal ICT work, or basically work associated with information and communication technologies that is around or just below the threshold of what we deem to be socially acceptable and or legally permitted. And that this brings into mind in particular, again, an emergent form of an online economy that kind of exploded in the context of the pandemic, which is that of OnlyFans. And of course, OnlyFans is interesting not only as a form of liminal cyber work, but it's also liminal, or kind of in this in-between phase as well, because of how it relates to our societal understanding of sex work as work, of sex workers, and how we conceptualize and stereotype them, and etc. So I'd like to talk more with you folks about that as well. So as you can see, globalization, or the process of international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture, has really shaped economic systems. And as such, anthropologists have done a lot of recently of studying economic systems with globalization in mind, right? That we've had to redefine a lot of what we might with so-called traditional economies, or economies that kind of existed prior to globalization. And so really we're talking about kind of really ancient economies, right? Almost into the world of archaeology, as it were. It's definitely influenced things like consumption. So there's been a lot of study looking at the consumption of resource by anthropologists over time. So people like Malinowski and Stewart, two key figures in early anthropological thought, have looked at, again, what are some of the explanations of how and why do we consume what we do, right? What is shaping our particular choices in what should be consumed and how they should be consumed, how resources are managed and distributed and reallocated and allocated within and between societies. We've also looked at the cultural construction of needs, and here are a couple of different examples of how needs might be constructed. So just because, for example, we have a wide variety of food resources available here in Edmonton in our own river valley, very few of us procure our food from the river valley. Many of us wouldn't even know where to start to look for foods in the river valley. And part of it is because we have constructed ideas around what is and is not appropriate food resources. There's also very specific prohibitions around the consumption of particular kinds of animal and plant products. Animals in particular have been greatly kind of shaped by these sorts of ideas. Of course, scarcity shapes a lot our idea of needs. And again, we can talk about this and attempt to understand a little bit more around how the pandemic has created a kind of a scarcity-based culture, and it's really influenced how we consume and what we consume. Again, the toilet paper of kind of disaster of 2020 is a great example of this, how scarcity was created because of overconsumption of a product, because of fears and concerns around lack of access to a resource. A lot of these ideas also relate to, again, how we broadly organize our society in terms of not just political organization, but social organization, particularly around things like affluence. And so, again, how do we know if we have too much? How do we know what our desires are? And there's a lot of discourse on social media around minimalism versus kind of what I kind of call like goblin core maximization, right? Like, do you want to be surrounded by stuff, or do you want no stuff? What kinds of stuff do you have? An example, again, we can talk about in a lecture is how globalization has also shaped consumptive habits and patterns. The failure of Starbucks in China's Forbidden City, and we've actually seen subsequent closure of other Starbucks in response to the pandemic and the pressure it's put on, like the labor market and commodities and et cetera and stuff like that. How it also shapes our cultural, or reflects our cultural values around consumption of goods. And there was a lot of controversy around Starbucks being present in the Forbidden City because some of the traditional tea making temples and structures that were already present in the Forbidden City, and some of the tensions that sometimes exist around ideas of modernization and progress and preserve of that which is traditional. So what I've attempted to capture here in my very quick summary, and again, we can go into some of these points a little bit more in depth in lecture on Wednesday, and I hope that you folks will be able to bring many examples that we can discuss a lot more in the classroom environment, is that for anthropologists, economics is looking at exchange as a behavior. And this is because exchange is something all societies engage in. However, of course, the mode of how we exchange, the rules under which we conduct exchange, are what vary cross-culturally. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you folks about this stuff in class. Take care, and we will chat soon.